Hello everybody and welcome to Alan History Nerd. In this video I'm going to look at the interpretations and debates around the US Constitution and Federalism. This is building on the numerous videos I've done already on the US Constitution and Federalism, just to kind of bring together some of the arguments and deal with a particular part of the A-level specification. So on the A-level specification for component 3, the US option, it tells us interpretations and debates around the US Constitution and Federalism, the extent of democracy within the US Constitution, its strengths and weaknesses and impact on the US government today, and the debates around the extent to which the US remains federal today. So we're going to look at both of those, and there is some really interesting stuff going on with relevance to the US Constitution at the moment. And again, a lot of this will play out, and one of the difficulties always with making these politics videos is that it's going to be right on the money if you're watching it around now, and it'll be interesting to see how this dates once we go a few more months down the line. So how democratic is the US Constitution? Well, elections are frequent, and we see this particularly with the House, where the House of Representatives is elected every 2 years, President's elected every 4 years, a third of the Senate is elected every 2 years. So that means that a senator has a term of 6 years, but a third is re-elected every 2 years. And that's just federal level. I mean, there are then state elections. Voting for members of the House, the legislatures in your state. You could be voting for governors, and then there's a whole other range of local officials that are also elected. So in that way, it is the Constitution is set up something that is enormously democratic. These elections, as I said, in terms of the dates, are regular. The politicians can't change when elections are to suit them, and again, this is overridingly democratic. I mean, they aren't even disrupted by the Civil War back in the 1860s. How fair they are, well, this is a little less clear cut. I mean, I would argue that US elections are very fair, but there are some aspects to them that make it slightly trickier. You've seen this if you've been watching the 2020 election. The Electoral College distorts the votes. So certain states are overrepresented, other bigger states are underrepresented. You've also, and hopefully we won't see this in 2020, but we saw a bit of it in 2016. You get faithless electors, and so the Constitution had this kind of worry, or the founding fathers had this worry about giving too much control to the mob, the people, and therefore the Electoral College kind of holds that back, and so it starts to look a little undemocratic in the modern world. Obviously, I mean, as I'm making this, Trump is stamping his feet, spitting his dummy out, and not letting anybody else play with his toys, and claiming mass election fraud. And as I make this video, there has been no evidence of any substance that has been presented to show that. So the Constitution does regulate these things, but a lot of the regulations or elections themselves go down to state level. But essentially, it has set up a democratic system with frequently elected representatives. And we've had changes to the Constitution over time. So, for example, we now have presidents who are limited to 2 terms. Now, other democratic methods or things we see in the Constitution are checks and balances. So they spread out power, preventing any one person having too much power, or any party having too much power. So Trump was restrained by the Democrat-controlled House of Representatives. Obama was checked by the Republican-controlled Congress. So what should happen in this situation is it should mean you have to build consensus, and therefore you should have to find something in the middle that both the Republicans and the Democrats are happy with. So Trump makes some kind of compromise with the Democrats in the House, and I can probably see your eyebrows raising at that moment, going, yeah, no. So that should lead to compromise and bipartisanship, and I've done video on bipartisanship already. And what that should do is you should end up with both sides being happy. However, It can lead to absolute gridlock when that consensus up bipartisanship is not found. And there is also, therefore, democratically, the very real possibility that neither Democrat voters or Republican voters get what they actually voted for. So in a UK election, one side wins, and kind of enormously wins. Now that has democratic problems in terms of how are they restrained, and how are the views of those who voted against them taken into consideration. But they have a clear mandate and they get on and do stuff. In the American system, you run this very real risk that you've voted for a Democrat president, as we've got President-elect Biden at the moment, and he's got this enormous number of votes. But depending on how the runoff goes in Georgia, it might well be we have a Republican-controlled Senate, and so Biden goes, I've got this big mandate and I'm going to do this, and then the Republicans in the Senate go, yeah, no, you're not. And then the Republicans aren't going to be able to get through what they want because the Democrats control the House and the presidency, and therefore the people's will could ultimately in all of this become less important, and nobody's getting really what they want. And what actually happens is based on backroom deals in Washington. And this ultimately is one of the reasons why Trump was elected going back 4 years ago, that people were a bit fed up with American politics, and that not much seemed to change. And it seems that people thought it needed shaking up because people would vote particular ways, but the Obama supporters got frustrated because they didn't get what they wanted, and the more conservative voters got frustrated because they didn't get what they wanted, because the counteraction, the checks and balances are in place. So you can see it's a wonderful thing for democracy because it prevents tyranny, it prevents one person or one party having too much power, but it can lead to problems as well in terms of nobody gets what they want. A very interesting example of this is the Affordable Care Act. So Obama won 2 elections, suggesting there was a great deal of support for his policies. But the people then also elected Republicans, first of all, giving them a majority in the House and then giving them a majority in the Senate. And they wanted, these people were elected wanting to block Obamacare and wanting to repeal it. And we ended up with this really odd situation where it got to a certain point, and then Obama couldn't take it any further. And then we've had Trump trying to unravel it, and we had the Republicans in the Senate trying to unravel it, and them not being able to get anywhere either. And so we've ended up with this kind of nowhere where it's kind of got stuck. And I think we'll see some stuff on that in the Supreme Court coming up as well. Continuing with this theme of how democratic is the US Constitution, well, we've got the Bill of Rights, and you'll say, well, the Bill of Rights offers itself as a kind of a really good, comprehensive protection of rights for citizens in the USA. And there's also the 14th Amendment that gives them legal protection, equal legal protection under the law. So you've got things like the First Amendment, which gives you freedom of speech, freedom of press, or links with things like freedom of religion. You've got the Fifth that gives you the right to remain silent, and you've got protection in terms of due process. The Eighth gives you protection from cruel and unusual punishment. Obviously, that's a little bit up for interpretation what that means. And of course, there's the Second, which gives you the right to have an automatic machine gun or whatever it is that you're allowed to have in America at this given moment in time. So your rights are protected, and they're very difficult to take away. So that would seem America will claim, it tells us that it is the land of the free. And a lot of people in terms of the liberal side of things in places like the UK would point at the US Constitution. We want something like that Bill of Rights that kind of enshrines these rights and means that no politician at any moment in time on a whim can take them off us. Having said that, the USA doesn't necessarily have the greatest record on minority rights. I mean, this is shown by the many years of segregation, which up until we get into the 1950s, 1960s, the Constitution doesn't seem to be able to be used to prevent. Again, you could argue that this is not a constitutional issue necessarily. It is down to the views of the people issue. Doesn't necessarily make it any better from an American point of view. That, I mean, really quite recently, 2013, we see the Shelby County v. the Holder case in the Supreme Court, and this struck down elements of the 1965 Voting Rights Act, which had been there to enable Black Americans to vote, which they've been prevented from doing so for getting on for 100 years at this point, and it has led to what are seen as discriminatory laws that have reduced minority groups' ability to vote in numerous states. And so, again, this idea that the Constitution is always going to be used for good and to protection of rights is not necessarily the case. And we've seen a piece of legislation that was aimed to help support rights of minority groups, and that being struck down by an interpretation of the Constitution by the Supreme Court. A 5-4 decision, that one. It was quite a narrow one. Overriding all this, and this is one of the issues with democracy full stop, so the electorate could elect politicians who would choose to erode rights that they currently have. I mean, one of the most famous ones, it hasn't quite made it on the statute book, but there is the Flag Desecration Amendment, which was all about burning American flags, and again, you could argue that's a freedom, a right of expression, but that's got quite close to getting through the House and the Senate with the 2/3 majority, and so that potentially, again, if voting goes a particular way in an election, that's something we could see happen, and that would be Americans voting for politicians who would then take away some of their rights. So the Constitution doesn't absolutely prevent the erosion of rights. What are the strengths of the US Constitution? Well, we've mentioned some of this already. There are frequent elections, 2 terms in the House in particular makes it highly responsive to public opinion. We've set out that there are checks and balances in the Constitution, and that prevents tyranny. That prevents one group becoming too powerful. We've seen that there are constitutional rights set out, particularly in the Bill of Rights and elsewhere in the Constitution, and we have the Supreme Court in the USA that acts to protect these rights. The amendment procedure is quite a difficult thing to get through. You need 2/3 in both houses, and then the agreement of 3/4 of all states, and that helps maintain a great deal of stability in US law and US politics, and it prevents politicians making use of temporary popularity to make sweeping changes. The US Constitution is vague enough at various points to allow it to continue to work. So whilst in other countries constitutions essentially hit a sell-by date, where what they've written about is no longer fits with the world that it's then in, the US one, there is enough vagueness in it to allow the interpretation to continue and allow its functioning in the modern world. And you can argue, and we'll look at this in a bit more detail, but federalism does continue and states' rights are protected. So we haven't seen federal government completely take over. What are the weaknesses of the US Constitution? Well, being codified and having this very demanding amendment procedure means the Constitution is seen by some as being too rigid, and therefore, whilst those who say that the US Constitution is strong will say that there's enough in there to mean it doesn't go out of date, others will point at this and go, it's gone out of date. I mean, the gun laws as they were set out at the time of the Founding Fathers, guns at that point bear no resemblance to guns as they are now. Society then bear no resemblance to society now. America was largely empty with all this wilderness and areas still to be explored, and in that context this kind of made sense, but now it doesn't. But the Constitution is so rigid it's impossible to adapt that, get rid of something out of the Bill of Rights. Again, and it seems odd that the two attacks, one for it being too rigid and another for it being too vague, but we can see that there are holes in it, and one of the most clear ones that's come out in actions of most recent presidents is the use of executive orders. So you've got presidents who can't get things through Congress because do that is too difficult, and so they use executive orders, which kind of overrides a lot of the checks and balances, and Trump, for example, increasingly in his term relied on those as a methodology of getting things done. And again, it seems that this this extensive use of executive orders isn't something the Constitution foretold or the founding fathers saw happening, and so there's a gap there. And the worry is well, how extensive is that going to get in the future? How far can that be taken? And are we going to see, for example, Congress being essentially bypassed? Again, we're going on this bit of, is it too rigid? Is it too vague? Well, again, another idea of it being in too rigid is it's the checks and balances are in a way too good, and it leads to these periods of gridlock. Notably, we had the 35-day shutdown of federal government under Trump. There's also been a failure, as we've talked about, to reach agreements over the Affordable Care Act. And the Supreme Court can constrain democratically elected governments and say, you want to do that? Well, you can't. And again, that would seem to be a weakness. It seems to be preventing democratic action. And we've also seen that the electoral system can distort the popular vote. And this was seen in 2016 when Trump won but lost the popular vote. And we've also then seen Trump questioning the validity of the 2020 election. And at this point, we're going to see, well, we are seeing a real test of the American Constitution and American democracy to whether it can stand up to this. And even the allegations, which are unfounded, is still damaging to America's standing and perceptions of American democracy. How does the US Constitution impact on current US politics? Well, we're seeing an ongoing debate within the Supreme Court and about appointments to the Supreme Court between the conservative originalist view on the Constitution, which takes a rather literal interpretation of the Constitution as it was intended, as it was written when first set out, and those who are more progressive or more liberal, who take a more contextualist or living constitutionalism, is often referred to. And this has been very, very significant in the appointments to the Supreme Court made by Trump, most notably the recent appointment of Amy Coney Barrett. And so, way that the Constitution is looked at is a big deal in US politics even today, and we see that in the way that how viciously that was fought, and how rapidly that was rushed in before the 2020 election. And it illustrates that the way the Constitution is viewed in the highest court in the US still has a massive impact on everything that goes on. And we're going to see some really big things in the Supreme Court, I think, over the next few years. Things like the Affordable Care Act, things like abortion. We're going to see some fairly significant moves, possibly, in the Supreme Court. Constitutional procedures are front and centre again at the moment, with Trump's disputing of the 2020 election result and seeking action through the courts. So there's also questions about well, what happens if he never accepts the result? There's lots of stuff going on about transition, and well, Biden needs to be getting these briefings and those briefings. What happens if we get to the day of the Electoral College and we get loads of faithless electors, and what pressure can Trump bring to bear on that? How much state intervention can there be in these elections? How much freedom have the states got to do it in their own way? Could he be leaning on Republican governors in some places to point, or Republican legislatures somewhere to do certain things? There looks like we're going to be getting either some great clarification of the Constitution in this area, or we're definitely going to run through some quite difficult times. We can see that the runoff elections in Georgia, which are going to take place in January, are going to be hugely significant, as they're going to be key to the balance of power in the Senate. And this is highly significant given the Senate's role as a check on presidential power, with appointments and passing of laws and treaties and all kinds of different things like that. So that is massively important. And again, it shows the setup of the checks and balances in the Constitution is still an enormous important part of current US politics. The COVID crisis has raised huge amounts of constitutional issues, particularly over individual rights and freedoms, and the limits to them. So, for example, ideas on mandatory mask wearing have been challenged in various courts throughout the US, and where your personal freedom and then your responsibilities to the other citizens around you begin and end. Constitutional positions on guns, abortion, capital punishment remain big issues in the US politics. They all link back to the Constitution, but these are hot issues that are highly debated. These are issues that have played in the election in 2020 and will continue to play out after it. So we can see here that things out of the Constitution, or parts of the Constitution, remain big topics in current US politics. Is federalism still working for the USA? Well, I'm going to look at the arguments to say, well, yes, it is, to start off with. So states are able to follow their own laws, different laws, and we've seen this, for example, the differing laws of marijuana across the states, and more states have shifted their position in 2020. I mean, we've seen, for example, that they all have different procedures on when votes are counted and the order in which votes are counted. We've seen that. So the states have an opportunity still to be different, to follow their own route. The 10th Amendment states that all powers not reserved to federal government go to the states. I mean, this was used in '97 to overturn the Brady Act that requires state officials to carry out background checks on all gun purchases. You might not like the outcome of that, but it does show that federal government can't just impose its will on state government. We see conservatives in the middle states and in the southern states that are able to resist some of the more liberal policies of federal governments under the likes of Clinton and Obama, and follow different direction on issues such as guns, gay rights, abortion. Again, these might be things that you fervently disagree with, and what it isn't about whether anybody's right or wrong on this issue. What it's about is that if that's the position that fits with the majority of people in that state, and that state is fundamentally different on its view on the world than others, then they can, in a federal system, they can be different, and the country as a whole can still function. We are seeing an increasingly divided America, and you'll see this if you look at the election maps in 2020, and the bits are blue and the bits that are red. Even if you go then drill down into the states and you see the difference between the cities and the difference between and the countryside and the more rural areas, you'll see an enormous difference. And again, we see that there are liberal progressive states and cities that have been able to go against Trump on things like his flying bans, his immigration bans. Particularly good example is the stuff that he's done in environment, where there's loads and loads of instances of states and cities across the United States saying, well, we're going to honour the Paris Climate Change Agreement, even if the federal government isn't. So again, be it conservatives going against liberal policies or liberals going against highly conservative policies or Trumpian policies, then we can see that we get still this variation over the last few presidencies in the states, and those state governments are maintaining that point of difference and that degree of power. The amendment procedure is something that gives states a lot of power. You need 3/4 agreements of all states. So one of the big issues at the moment is looking at things like the Electoral College. Well, those states that we see being massively overrepresented, that's unlikely to change because there's quite a number of small states, and therefore they're unlikely to vote for changes to the Electoral College and movement towards more of a popular vote. Right, the counter argument to this then. Well, federal mandates are used and these impose national standards. So, for example, Obama's Affordable Care Act limited state choices on healthcare, required them to set up health exchanges and threatened to remove their finances if they didn't. And federal government does provide states with about 25% of their income, and this means that they can impose conditions on that money that goes to them. It's a huge amount of money, and therefore that would seem to be eroding the independence of the states and showing increased federal power. Article 1, Section 8 gives federal government power to regulate commerce and with foreign governments and between states, and this is being used to justify the growth of federal power in all kinds of areas which are only kind of very loosely connected to commerce. And again, this is seen by those who don't like it as an ongoing march of an increase in federal power. Thank you very much for watching. I hope that's been helpful for you and given you an idea of some of the arguments about federalism and in particular about the US Constitution. If you found it useful, then please hit like. If you've got any comments or questions, then please add those. And if you haven't done already, then please subscribe to the channel as I continue to add more and more videos on A-level politics. I'm aiming to cover the entirety of the spec this academic year, and there's also loads and loads of stuff on a variety of different history topics on here as well. So thank you very much for watching. I hope to see you all again soon.